Sorry about that. I just gotta make sure everybody is just coming in. That's all. So you watch this in audio. I just went silent then just because I gotta make sure everybody can come in. Okay, let's get the ball rolling. Okay, today's episode is going to be focused on declining population. What is the cause of declining population in the developed world? Now, start off the developed world, it used to be called the second world or the East, because they divide the world into three portions. This is very much legacy from the Cold War period. They changed the terminology a bit just so it sounded more politically correct. So rather than just East versus West, it just did developed world and global South. And the second world was obviously Russia, the old Soviet Union bloc. So for the purpose of this podcast, the developed world is pretty much the Western world. It's Western Europe, it's America, it's Japan, it's South Korea. That's very much the developed world. The developing world is like places like used to be China, I would say, India, places in Africa, and Brazil, I would say South America. They're the developing world. And the Eastern world, or the second world, as we call it, because the third world is the global South. The second world is pretty much the old Soviet bloc. That's how they traditionally divided things. The terminology, as I said, has changed just because if I use East and West, it can be sound politically inflammatory. Personally, it is what it is. I personally like to call a spade, a shovel a shovel. None of this tiptoeing around stuff, personally, but that's the politically correct language anyway. Now, to start off why the population is declining, I'm going to take us down memory lane. I'm going to explain how we got there, how we actually developed. Human beings, we started off as hunter gatherers in the sub Saharan Africa. It's where we started off as a species and we spread obviously around the world. You might know some of this from school as well. Obviously, the early humans, they found rivers, river power, like paddling and stuff like that. So they actually, turn, so they can farm better and they can take that farmland, change it into food and get more grain. Obviously, when this started happening, they could do irrigation, like obviously places like the Nile. So there's irrigation, more food, more people, many cities and large towns could be developed. And from those large towns, military force could also be applied because early human beings, primitive farming. See, human beings, we found like a revolutionary way to actually grow food, and that is human poo. Human poo is some of the best fertilizer in the world until modern fertilizers were created. So it was the human poo that enabled humans to actually grow better crops. And with that, we also developed the concept of like nationhood as well, primitive nationhood, because obviously when primitive humans we start to build the farms, start to have irrigation, those farms need to be protected, so they need to start building walls, start building fortresses to actually guard those lands. Because obviously tribal humans, when they would try to pass through the lands, they would pick an area clean within 2 weeks. So that land needed to be protected, stop the land being taken by hunter gatherers. Now I'm going to fast forward a bit now. I'm just trying to make a explanation why humans started developing cities over time. It's to do with agricultural revolution, the poo revolution, and obviously from there, certain agricultural technology we invented, like the use of wind power as well. So we can actually start building windmills and start building lands for farming deeper and deeper into the flat plains. So that can mean the population could actually grow. Now, as for the I'm going to bring us to the 19th century now. I know it's a big jump. I'm just doing this. I'm trying to lay out a very simple way to explain the reason why we have population decline and why the population's changed. Because in 1800, 20% of people lived and worked in cities. 80% of people worked on the farmlands. That changed with the Industrial Revolution and urbanization. Places like Germany, they were one of the earliest to urbanize. The UK did not urbanize the same way as Germany. And because of that, that's one of the reasons why Germany has one of the oldest demographics in the world. And that's why Germany now, from a demographic point of view, this could be the last generation of Germany as a power in Europe, just because they haven't been having replacement generation, because they were the earliest to one of the earliest to urbanize. That meant they didn't build replacement generations. And last time Germany had the baby boom was during that time period they don't like to talk about, under Nazi Germany. They started having more and more babies. It hasn't really been the same since. In terms of population, I don't mean in terms of the other stuff. I'm sure I was talking about population. I'm not talking about, Nazi Germany. But in terms of population growth, so they haven't got replacement generation. And the same thing also happened in Russia as well. From Russia during the time of Stalin, 13 to 16 million people died from starvation. 22 million died from the concentration camps and just through Stalin's policies. So you're talking over 35 million dead in the span of less than 30 years. You've also got 22 million that also died during the World War II. So you have all these numbers up, that's population, that these are men as well dying, and people are dying, civilians are dying, so they're not being replaced. So during that time period, under the Soviet control, the Russian population kept getting smaller and smaller. And the way Russia wins its wars is by using its population to actually fling them at the enemy, kind of thing. Because when they were fighting Nazi Germany, the Russians, they used to have they used the fact the Germans 1-5 or 2-1, those kind of numbers, so that they didn't win through purely tactical acumen, but through sheer numbers. And also Russia itself it has really bad geography. So it doesn't have a sophisticated road network due to this geography. That's why their supply lines are very much on the train networks. And that's why they're in trouble now conquering Ukraine, just because they've got crap supply lines. That's something to think about as well. And also during the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1980s, early 1990s, because it didn't just fall straight away. The population dropped. It dropped even further in 1990. So now there isn't a population available to replace the existing Russian population. Similar thing happened in Germany as well, because with the East and West, there's the East is a lot more popular than the Western Germany. And if people don't really have hope for a better future, they tend not to have children. And again, with urbanization, back to urbanization, the reason why urbanization led to population decline, this was over a period of 7 generations. From the UK, industrialization happened over 7 generations. For something like Japan, China, that happened within 1 generation, within 40 years of industrial development. Because if you're the first to industrialize, you're the first to go to technologies, you're the first to actually go through each step slowly. But if your country is industrializing today or is modernizing today, they can skip all these steps and get the work done within 1 generation. Now, the reason why the population is declining, I would say, is this. When people move into cities, family and children become a liability. They're no longer a positive, they become a negative. Because obviously, if you have children when you're working on the farm, you need more labour to actually live. You need people more working, more bread, more people means more free labour from your children. When you move into cities, urban areas, your children and your family can start to become a liability. Because say if you buy a property with 3 rooms, that's 1 room for yourself, for your wife, for your husband, whatever your arrangements are, and that leaves another room just for your children. So that's not much space. So you only got room for like 1 or 2 children in that kind of environment. And also because you don't do farmland anymore, having more children is no longer positive; it becomes a negative. Another reason I would say was the invention of electricity. I would say electricity is one of the reasons that women also became liberated with feminism, because with electricity, it means you can work past dark. You don't have to work using candlelight. You can work past dark. You can start reading books. You can start educating yourself. You can develop new skills. And there's liberated women from the roles of mothers as well. There's nothing wrong with being a mother, but it gave them the freedom to actually learn to do other tasks as well. And also the same applies to men, because when you finish work, say that you're working, they would have worked more than this. This is more like a modern example. Say if you work like 18 to 10 hours a day, That means by the time you finish work, you probably got, I'd say, 2 to 4 hours. I would say we can actually do additional work. You can do some self-education skills. You can do some courses. You can read books. You can read books, and with that, can actually, that's liberating yourself more economically as well because you can actually grow your skill set. So that's a new way of liberation. And with that, children become more of a liability because children need to be looked after. You got to play with them for at least an hour a day. So you got to play with them. You got to spend time with them. You got to teach them. You got to be a father. You got to be a mother. You got to be a carer, which is an important job. The problem with that, if you've got 3 young children, 4 young children, you're going to be so exhausted by the time you've done that. You're not going to have time to actually do the other stuff as well. I would also add in there the television as well is also a factor, I would say, because television, social media, if you're watching social media, if you're watching Coronation Street with your partner, you're not going to be there with them. You're watching television, you're not going to feel very romantic watching television, going on social media, and you got your parents, not your parents, you got your partner there looking at you, trying to give you the look kind of thing. He's not going to work because you're not going to connect on that level as well because you're going to be tired from looking after your children and you're going to be tired from doing all the other stuff that's really not really useful really because I swear Coronation Street and places like social media, it rots people's brains. I don't mean literally, but I think it's wasted time. I think it's one of the reasons why population is actually declining as well. I know in the UK another reason is the actual labour costs as well, because women still do the primary cleaning in the household. In the United Kingdom, it's 16 hours. In Japan, it's 25 hours for Japanese women, and still men don't really do the lion's share or the lioness's share of the household chores. I think they're changing a bit, but it's still predominantly women that do that work. So if you're a woman, you're working 35 hours, you're working 25 hours, you're working 45 hours. When you get home, you'll be doing 16 to 25 hours of cleaning. You're going to have children, childcare on top of that as well. And also, with all that pressure, there'll be also pressure as men as well. You're not going to have time to expand your family just because you'll be that exhausted. I mean, in Japan's case, Japan's actually, especially because Japan's population has been declining for, I think it's since the 1900s. I know it's been dipping since the 60s as well, but it's been a very long time. Japan's declined because the way Japan is very mountainous. Because places with mountains, they tend to have a low population, or they don't have enough space to actually, make more children. Because I think the average space for a Japanese apartment or I think it's 275 meters. I might have those measurements a bit long. If you're watching this, if you don't mind, you can put the correct measurements in the comment section just because it's fair for everybody else and they can have a look at it themselves as well. But that's what it is really. Now, because of that, they don't have much space. That means when they do make a family, that means they've got to share a tiny space with another person. That'll probably be, in the terms of population growth, typically for a man or a woman to reproduce, they need to find a person of the opposite sex. So when those people come together, they start typically having children. Now, because of that, they've got a small area as well. That means they've got to be able to communicate and work cooperatively as well with each other. That's in a tiny space. So some of them are thinking that why would I get a tiny apartment with one person? I can have the same apartment I live by myself with some more freedom. That's a real option as well. And again, women are expected to do most of the house chores. I know Japan, the Japanese government, they have been trying to actually change this. They launched the Angel One program in the 1990s and Angel Two in the 2000s, trying to give tax incentives for couples to have more children. But that's not happening. Japan now has more adult diapers than diapers for children being sold because the population is that old. But Japan is fixing this by outsourcing. They're outsourcing the labor. They're outsourcing a lot of these tasks to also machines as well. Japan is the most technological advanced nation in the world. So they're going to solve this issue through technology and through outsourcing. Japan have also made deals with the United States as well for its protection because Japan doesn't have the population to actually fight, or just because it's too old. That's the population. That's the problem. Same problem that Russia's going to have as well. in the future, the next decade or two, because they don't have the population to actually fight. I only mention this because I'm going to do another podcast. Maybe not. It won't be this week. It'll most likely be sometime late next week on globalization, because globalization now in the next decade could potentially be going away. Because if the Americans say we don't want to protect the supply chain anymore, we don't want to protect shipping, we don't want to protect its allies, without globalization, the world will revert to the form it was traditionally. That's the order before World War II, before 1945 and Bretton Woods. In 1944, Bretton Woods was. That was basically where they hammered out the global order after the World War. That was for the West primarily, where the Americans would guarantee global trade. With global trade, you get like a global economies of scale. So if you're living in some place like Saudi Arabia, Syria, for example, where you had crap farmland, where you couldn't actually grow enough, you could import your goods from Europe, from Africa, from China, wherever, to come to your country and actually start importing more food. That means you could grow. That means they could expand their population. That's one of the reasons for the war is in Syria and Tunisia. I believe it was Tunisia where it started. The Arab Spring back in the early last decade. It was started because of food shortages in the supply chain. So that it was is that kind of security that the Americans guarantee. See, one of the reasons why Japan went to go and try to conquer China and East Asia, just because Japan itself has no really natural resources. So the only way to do that, to industrialize, Japan had to get into debt, and it needed to build its empire, because all the other empires like France, Germany, United Kingdom, even the United States, they put their own interests first. So what Japan had to do in order to survive, it had to go forth and build its empire, just so it had the economies of scale so it could function. After World War II, when Japan was defeated, with the dropping of the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I think it killed over 200,000 people, 250,000 people, something like that in terms of numbers. Was that Japan, they're expecting their government, their nation, to cease to exist, because that's what would have happened in the old order. But what the Americans did, they changed all that. We really got a lot to be thankful for the United States. I know people give them a lot of crap, but we do have a lot to be grateful, because they created the peace and prosperity that we live in now. The world has never been more peaceful, at least in terms of the West, because Europe used to be a war zone for centuries. Since the fall of Rome, Europe was a mess for a very long time. I mean, you look at the history between England and France, it's just a never-ending slugging match. Same with Germany and France as well. It's just if you anybody who knows history knows that Europe was a mess for a long time, but the Americans, they changed all that. They created the economy of scale so people could trade. See, if that goes away, that means global trade goes away. That means if countries don't have a secure supply chain, like when it comes to access to oil, access to food, that means population will starve and the price of goods will start to rise. So that'll cause massive problems. That's why places like the Middle East, desert climates, they've got a population that's dependent on global trade. Without the United States, that all goes away. That's something to be grateful. That's something to be aware of, because that's a possibility. I mean, this argument was made by Peter Zillan. He's the author of the Disunited Nations and the End of the World is Just Beginning. He was a writer 15 years for a website called Stratford, which is a geopolitical website. So this kind of stuff is very interesting. So potentially, if that goes on for the United Kingdom, it's an island nation, but when an island nation doesn't have a fleet, England doesn't really have its own foreign policy, or the United Kingdom, I say, don't have its own foreign policy. It don't have its own resource, its own fleet, just for that's different. But I'm going more into geopolitics there. Again, I'm going to cover this in another podcast. I'm going to try and keep it more focused on the population. Now, in order for capitalism to work, people must have children. People must have children, because More people means more consumers. More consumers means more capital that can be invested into more products or services. Without a big enough population, that causes a problem as well, because the population ain't replacement level. The solution to this is immigration, but I don't know how it is, because I know I'm speaking to people also from India, from America, from France, from Italy, people from different countries, different walks of life. For myself, for the United Kingdom, we don't actually have a proper conversation about immigration. It's too linked in with right or left and racial politics and ethnicities and stuff like that. It's too linked in, but no one was having the conversation that if you bring people into your country, that can solve your population problems. For somewhere like, say, Japan, right? I mean, not Japan, China. Well, China and Japan, but we're going to talk about China. For China, they're going to have their population, I think it's about 1 billion now, but it has come out recently that the Chinese have given the world the wrong numbers, that they've overcounted by 100 million people. So that's you can't really trust the Chinese statistics in that sense. And by the end of the century, they'll be going from over 1 billion people to over 600 million people. So the population is going to just collapse, and that's just going to be a disaster for their economy as well, because they're not going to have enough people. So a solution to that would be immigration. And again, because I believe China has over 200 million shortage of women. They don't have enough women per man. Not that I'm saying that men should be given a ratio of women. I'm just saying you need like a man and a woman. Well, you need more women than you do men, because 30% of men don't actually reproduce. 30%. It's still that, because a lot of men, there's a large portion of men in terms of society that never actually reproduce anyway. That's why you always end up getting with like several women, several men having fathers from different women. It just how it is. But the Chinese, they've got a woman shortage. So where does women come from? You only get women with two methods: birth and immigration. So that could be a solution as well. But again, that's not going to happen, because in the United Kingdom or in America, if I went to America, I would become an American. If I went to like if I was somebody from like India or something, I came to the Great Britain, you'd be considered British within, when you get, because there's like there's the state identity, there's the national identity, British, and then you got your ethnic identity, which would be Welsh, Scottish, and English, and Northern Irish. So you got that there. Places like China doesn't do this. So if I move to China now, I move to China, I move to Japan, they will not see me as Chinese. Even if I lived there for 20 years, I would never be considered a Chinaman or a Japanese person. It just doesn't work like that. It's like in quite a few countries as well, because I know with France as well. France was the first country, I believe, that identified its ethnicity with the state, and that was French, and that was white French. And with that, France in the late 1700s, during the French Revolution, from in 1798, the storming of the Bastille. So I just need a sip of water. Okay. Sorry about that. My throat will get a bit dry. Now, the storming of the Bastille in 1789. See, the French, the way they did it, they identified the French with the Parisians in that part of France. But France at that time period was very diverse. It was very diverse in terms of its regional cultures, because France went from being like the Kingdom of France to a Republic of France. With that, they needed to create the national identity, because in Normandy you would have the Normans. They would be different from the Parisians, the Parisian French. You would have the Angevins. You had people in southern France as well, which they even spoke a different language. And what the French did, what the revolutionaries did, what Napoleonic France did, and it succeeded in 5 republics, they created the national identity, which was French. The problem with that, it made the French people it didn't give them like regional identities anymore because everybody in France was French. They don't do like because at the moment I think there's like 10% of the population in France, 9-10% actually ethnically French, but France don't see it that way because of that. They run the risk of sectarianism, and also from its old colonies when it started decolonizing in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, for people like Algeria when they moved to France because they identified as French, they was not seen by French by the people living in France, and because of that, they never really successfully integrated, and that's a problem. That's what nations have got to really focus on, because if you're going to try and solve the problem with immigration, you got to bring the people in and accept them into your culture. But with that understood as well, if somebody comes into your culture, if people come into your state, they have the right to vote, they have the right to education, they have the right to all these services. They also have the right to change the political environment. It's their right, because if they become citizens, they have the right to take part in political discourse. And people don't understand that. Say if I move to America, I don't believe in people owning guns because I'm English. I believe in National Health Service, which over in the United States might be seen as negative in quite a few quarters. The same applies if Frenchmen move to England, if I move to France, and so forth, and something like that. So if people come in, you're actually going to change the political culture. I know in the United Kingdom there were some protests a couple of months ago now about doing LGBTQ education in one of the local schools. The problem with that because it was a very dominant conservative area for like particularly it was Muslims, I believe it was, and they were conservative. They were from places like Pakistan, I believe it was, and basically they were saying that it wasn't against their culture. Because it's not against their culture. They're also British citizens. They have the right to say that. They have the right to change the laws. They have the right to take part in political discourse. So that's something that people don't keep in mind. People, if people come to a country, that they have the right to make decisions, the right to vote, and that will change the politics of the country for better or for worse. And also there's the own culture as well, because one great thing about British culture, I would say, is that we're very elastic. We're very elastic. We can bring in more cultures into our culture. We can make them a part of England, but something like that takes time because it takes 3 or 4 generations of people to actually to integrate. I work with a woman called Linda Sage. If you go into my LinkedIn, you actually find in my profile work wise, you actually find as well because I work with her as well. She did some work. She did some work on working integrating people from like Pakistani communities or communities where they have like tight knit families. Because I myself, I know someone who he lives with his parents, live with his brothers, lives with his sisters, and also lives with his grandparents as well. So that's a big family all living together in a space. And because of that, they're going to have like links either back to their original home country, and also it takes longer for them to actually integrate because you're still connected to your family. You're not going to go far off and marry into local communities because people get when you immigrate. Say if I went to the United States, I try to contact the local English community because it's quite big in the United States. It's same with immigrants for safety and advice. That's what you do. So when you go there, you're not going to go there and immediately marry somebody from a different community necessarily, or even integrate that way. That's what it takes at least 3 generations more if it's very family orientated. Again, I think I've got a bit sidetracked there a bit. But I just think it's important to understand when it comes down to population growth, there is solutions for it. It's just whether or not the state or the nation is prepared to have that conversation. Because I don't see China, or at least the Communist Party, necessarily going to survive this. Because if you got like a 200 million female shortage, that's going to lead to rebellion and civil discourse. Just because single men are typically dangerous for society, and that could potentially bring down the state. Oh, sorry about that. Just hmm. throat is really dry for some reason. Oh yeah. So again, another reason for population decline, I would say, is is social media. I would say that, and also the work-life balance as well. I don't really necessarily a such thing of that. I would say because it's hard to get right. Because you're supposed to give like if you're going to develop any kind of relationship, not just romantic but personal, you've got to spend time with this person. There's no point in just texting someone over phone because I think social media gives the illusion of connection. You're not developing true connection. So if you only contact someone because you want something, you're not developing any like tight bonds. So if you contact somebody, you say you want to go out for a cup of coffee, you got to actually spend time with that person. So if you're working 35 to 45 hours a week, you're not going to have the necessary time to spend time with your friends, spend time with your family. That's why a lot of men, by the time they hit the 30s, they tend to lose contact with the friends because the focus is mostly on either their career, their wives or girlfriends or family. So that means their sort of like social circle really shrinks, and that thereby tends to get outsourced to their wives or girlfriends. They become kind of like their HR department, the human resources department, just because they're very good at those kind of social skills. I would also say that the way that men and women communicate and interact and develop bonds is very different as well. Because typically, I think it's to do with evolutionary psychology. That men we tend to bond by doing things. We get together. We're going to go and hunt down the gazelle or whatever it is. That's the way of bonding. Because we don't interact anymore, we work remote, and if we do interact, the reason for that friendship becomes a bit shallow because it's not really necessary in a practical sense. I think that's a very big reason for decline as well. I would say just because we haven't got the time to be together. That's a big issue as well. Another issue, I think I pretty much covered everything now because I mentioned one reason was, yeah, I think that's pretty much covered everything for this episode. Thank you for listening. I hope this has been clear for you. Please leave a comment in the comment section if you don't like this episode, if you like this episode, just because I put a lot of information out there. I just want to make sure you understand it the way that I've said it. Just because I have really, there's a lot of information for you to unpack. I hope you found this useful. Thanks for listening to the Renaissance Humanism podcast. My name is Jonathan Riley, and please don't forget to leave a like, leave a comment, and please share this with your friends. I do take constructive feedback reasonably as well, but just because I want to make this do better as well, I want this podcast to be better, and I really want you to enjoy this experience. Thanks for your time, and thanks for listening.